and examples of how we have applied. All right, so let's begin here. First, some brief background about why network concepts and network analysis are helpful systems tools. So Williams and Himmelbrunner offer 3 helpful distinctions of a system: interrelationships, perspectives, and boundaries. So networks are all about interrelationships, and thinking or analyzing in terms of networks requires that you take an explicit perspective about who or what the nodes represent, what is flowing in the network, and what are the boundaries of the network. So because they provide insight into these interrelationships, perspectives, and boundaries, they provide insight into the behavior of the system. And with insight comes the possibility of wise intervention to improve the system. But how will you know what kind of insight or intervention you're looking for unless you know what kind of network is a good network? What counts as a good network? This was my question for my master's thesis. So I went looking in the adaptive co-management literature, which is environmental governance. And really anybody who does social network analysis will tell you that what counts as a good network depends on what you want out of the network. So again, here is where perspectives show up in network analysis. So from the CIA's perspective, for example, a good terrorist network is so completely fragmented that it doesn't exist. But many of us on this call today work with collaboration networks that we actually want to evaluate, nurture, and enhance. So today I'm going to show you why and how a modular adhocracy is a good collaboration network. These are big multisyllabic words. They come from the network analysis literature so that you can actually go and find these concepts in the literature. But I'll show you it's actually a pretty common sense way of thinking about networks. At the end, again, I'll show you some ways that we've been applying it both as a heuristic and informative. All right, so collaboration networks are good when they promote collective action, social learning, and resilience over time, right? So I'm taking this big step back and looking at a network over time, not just at one snapshot, but I want to look at how is this network behaving over time? Is it going to be sustainable? Is it an enduring form of governance that's actually going to help a situation? Maybe a lot of you are working in a collective impact scenario or in other forms of nonprofit or public health where a lot of coalitions and networks are established and then never really meant to go away, right? We've just put them in place for decades and decades. And this is also the case in environmental governance, which is where I approach this from, where we have networks that are governing entire landscapes and entire resources. So why is it important for collaboration networks to promote collective action, social learning, and resilience? The answer goes back to our famous picture from Systems Thinking of the Adaptive Cycle. This is from the book Panarchy, edited by Gunderson and Halling. And the adaptive cycle, you've probably seen this before. It does come out of the environmental governance literature. And the reason that our collaboration networks need to be promoting collective action, social learning, and resilience is because they need to move through, we want them to move through this adaptive cycle without a lot of collateral damage, right? Sometimes these systems become what we call like maladaptive or stuck in rigidity traps or poverty traps, or if things get really stuck, then suddenly the whole system will collapse and there's just a lot of collateral damage. And we would like to create resilient systems that don't have those problems as they move through the adaptive cycle. So let's look at how networks can promote these systems moving through the adaptive cycle smoothly and effectively. So what I found in my meta-synthesis of the literature is that in the front loop, where we move from exploitation to conservation, we are definitely taking advantage of our resources and putting them to use It's like this part of the loop is turning potential energy into kinetic energy, and eventually kinetic energy into stored energy. Often the picture is of a new forest where the trees are growing up and all of the sunlight and the nutrients are being stored in the trees. So collective action networks are very dense. They promote this specialized communication with a lot of trust building, a lot of deliberation, and they're developed when birds of a feather flock together because they have a common specialized interest. So they develop their own interesting group norms, tacit knowledge, all kinds of stuff that we've all experienced in our day-to-day lives. It's actually really important to develop specialized knowledge in these collaborative networks so that you can take advantage of turning potential resources into realized and capitalized resources. But that's only half the loop, right? Eventually, as the times change, you want to be able to move with the times and adapt. Maybe you need to literally liquidate some resources, free up some things, reassess your assumptions. We call that double loop learning. Maybe bring outside perspectives. And we call that transitioning to the back loop, where you release these resources and then you reorganize them into a new fashion. And structural holes in networks are really good for this kind of learning and communication. So I mean social learning here in the sense of innovation, transfer of simple encoded information. There's of course social learning that happens in collective action where, you know, specialist 1 is learning from specialist 2. Here we're talking about a specialist from one discipline learning from a specialist in a different discipline. That's just a different kind of communication, and it's promoted by a different kind of network that is more open. You see these holes between the nodes. There just aren't as many ties, and the ties tend to be a little bit weaker. And I hope that all of you know of the title of the book by Granovetter, The Strength of Weak Ties, right? So weak ties is just a no social network term. They're actually very strong for doing certain kinds of things. So what we've seen already is that we need strong ties in the front loop especially, and then we need weak ties in the back group. And resilience happens when the system can flip back and forth between these two at the right time, around the right issues, around the right variables. So it's helpful, right, if you have these local groups that are maybe like disciplines in or departments in a university where they're really connected. They have their own departmental culture, things like that. But they need to be connected to other groups outside of that so that eventually, as times change, for instance, maybe the biology and the chemistry department spin off a new department called biochemistry, right? So we got local redundancy of lots of specialists about who are specializing in one kind of thing, and they all are pretty similar to each other relatively to the rest of the network. Local redundancy and global diversity so that they're still connected to other types of expertise and other resources in the network. So why is that important? Well, it's because of this idea called panarchy, where no matter how you draw the boundaries of a system, you can always think of subsystems within that system. And some of this is what we mean when we say systems are driven by fast and slow variables. So some things change relatively quickly within a system. If you think of an ecosystem, the amount of daylight during the day, you know, changes hour by hour. But some things are rather small or rather large and slow, like the rate at which the carbon is sequestered in those trees. So even if I drew the boundary around a particular forest stand, I still have lots of different variables all operating in their own adaptive cycle at different rates and paces. When we talk about social networks, we talk about people or institutions or other social structures stewarding one or more of those fast and slow variables. So those networks need to be able to change quickly and slowly depending on which variable they're stewarding. So that's why it's important that these little pieces of the network are all connected to each other, because that's the way systems work, interrelationships. So this is why networks need to function with collective action, social learning, and resilience. And how does a modular adhocracy actually make this possible? So a module in social network language is just a little section of the network that has more strong ties within the module than without. So you can look at a picture of a network and you can probably pick some of these out by eye. There are also social network analysis measures that you can use to measure modularity. But if you're just practicing and you're living out a collaborative network, you probably know in your head where those strong ties are, like where those modules are, and then where are the holes between the modules. So that's one module. The entire network is modular if it has lots of modules, and there are what we call these structural holes in between them. Remember, we saw earlier that these open networks with holes in them are actually really good. That's the strength of weak ties idea. But that only works if we actually are able to close those holes. Holes are like potential energy, and we need to convert those into kinetic energy that we can actually use with cross-boundary brokers. So a lot of us on this call today are evaluators. I think we often find ourselves in this role, right, where we're bridging all of the multiple stakeholder groups that are in our evaluation team. But these cross-boundary brokers play an absolutely essential role. Without them, all you have is a modular siloed network that can be pretty maladaptive, sometimes, just pretty dysfunctional. We all know about the silo syndrome, and that's kind of frustrating. But cross-boundary brokers can facilitate what Henry Mintzberg in 1979 called adhocracy, which is his term for the opposite of bureaucracy. And adhocracy is flexible, self-renewing, and organic because the interactions and changes in the institutional structure happen through direct interaction and not through formalized rules. So this is in direct opposition to the idea of legislating interaction or making sure that you're tracking every and enforcing every possible interaction. Again, there are times where a centralized approach can really help in that front loop, but if you stick with that, you'll get stuck in a rigidity trap and you won't be able to transition to the back loop very gracefully. So adhocracy will help transition to that back loop with the help of these cross-boundary brokers. All right, that's a lot. I had the privilege of writing this up for a paper to hopefully come out in a special issue of Ecology and Society very soon. And I had the help of a computer science student put this into a video for me. So I'm going to show that video. It's only 1 minute and 45 seconds. There's a little bit of narration to kind of tie all the previous slides together. So we'll flip on over. We tested this yesterday. It should be fine. Again, please post questions that you have.
This is an example of a modular adhocracy. The gray stars represent cross-boundary brokers who facilitate adhocracy. The squares, triangles, and circles all represent values of a certain attribute, for example, topical expertise. The colors represent another attribute, say position title. In the first time step, there are 3 modules that are grouped by shape. All the squares are with the squares, and so on. In the second time step, a module has formed in which all the orange actors came together for some collective action. In the third time step, the orange module has dissolved, but 2 of the original modules, the squares and the triangles, have merged. Notice the module of circles has endured throughout. In such a way, modular adhocracies balance the cohesive needs of collective action and the structural whole needs of social learning, thus producing resilience through local redundancy and global diversity. This example sequence will repeat 2 more times in this video.
So I'm just going to let this play through to the end. It takes some time to absorb it. I really just like watching it. It's like a kaleidoscope, kind of mesmerizing. Yeah, when you have a picture in your head for 4 years and then you can finally see it on the screen, it's a good feeling. I hope that this picture sticks in your head too, because we're going to talk about next how we can apply this, either as a heuristic or as a standard for formal analysis. All right. One more time. Again, this is just an example. Modular autocracies don't all have to follow this particular pattern. What we're looking for is that modules are forming and dissolving at different rates, and there are cross-boundary brokers. Pretty simple, right? So you can use it as a heuristic if you are kind of doing maybe developmental evaluation where you don't have time to do a full network study, or maybe you're just a manager or another professional facilitator or other part of a collaboration. You can ask yourself, you know, to what extent are we embodying a modular autocracy? And if not, how could we improve that? It's possible to err on both sides. You could have a system that is too modular. We have that silo syndrome, and things are really rigid. Autocracy isn't happening. Or I've also worked with systems that are kind of dysfunctional because they're too what we call ad hocratic, where no one's really in charge and just people are constantly moving around and this idea and this idea and this idea. And that's where, you know, what we call a poverty trap can happen, because you're not able to actually convert potential ideas into realized action. So you need both modularity and adhocracy, all right? You can also use this in formal analysis, and again, step-by-step is available on my website if you search Easy SNA. I gave a presentation about this at the Environmental Evaluators Network a couple years ago. So how do you use this, either as a heuristic or in formal analysis? First, you need to take a snapshot of your system. You can focus on just one level of the system, or you can look at the system overall. You need to see which part of the adaptive cycle you're in. So if you know that your program's been kind of doing the same thing for a long time, then you're probably in the conservation phase, and you would expect to see some really strong, tight networks looking really modular, right? If your system has just undergone a reorganization, you might see things starting to open up a little bit. And again, this can be either just your experience, you're reflecting on this as your mental model, or you might actually see this in your network data. And stop here if this is all you need, right? Because this is based on theories about which social networks accomplish which kinds of things. If you just take a snapshot and you're like, okay, right now I know that we need to get something done. Let's create a more cohesive, centralized network so that we promote collective action. But if you're looking at this kind of overall, taking a diagnostic of the entire system, then you want to see if modules exist. Sometimes it can be helpful, like if your system is in crisis and like everybody's all hands on deck, then you might only see one module, but maybe over time, you know that you have certain departments or you have certain work groups that or standing committees. This is where like historical analysis can be really helpful to give you a sense of how the system has acted in the past. So you want to look for modules, and then you want to look for adhocracy, right? So you need to see if over time those modules are forming and dissolving at different rates. And especially if your cross-boundary brokers are facilitating that. Sometimes it's really hard to do longitudinal analysis just because it's really expensive or requires a lot of expertise or time that you don't have. You can substitute other kinds of qualitative data to see, for example, is there potential for adhocracy, or have things become so rigid that there's actually just no way that adhocracy can happen? Or you can look back in history and time and kind of retrospectively take a baseline and see how were things in the past. You also need to take a look at the context.
Let me just interrupt, folks. This is time to be asking questions because we're going to move to that in a couple of minutes.
Perfect. Yep. And then I have 2 more slides. You also need to take a look at the context to see if there's a culture of collaboration, if people have a mindset that is open to new ideas, if there are rules that promote intermixing of departments and collaboration, etc. So a few ways that we have applied this already. Formal analysis, we've looked at environmental governance at the county level in Southwest Wisconsin, and also at the provincial level with 2 provinces in Sicily, which is super cool. And then as a heuristic in a church, actually, as a pastor was looking at how he could improve his ministry organization, and then in work groups in the University of Wisconsin Extension. So if you'd like to be notified when the paper and the video are published so that you can refer to them, please sign up for my new content mailing list, which is on my website or my Facebook page. And please let me know how you're using modular adhocracies in your work, because we're very interested in to see if or when these types of networks are the best for collaboration and how useful the concept is for researchers and professionals. So hopefully that idea is helpful to you. And again, if you have any questions, check it out.
We do have a couple of questions. One question has to do with the role of brokers. And it's basically, is it once a broker, always a broker? In other words, are brokers able, or do they ever sort of change roles? Or if you're a broker, you a broker in a network?
Yeah, absolutely. Brokers change roles. Brokers are actually really good at changing roles. That's one thing that makes them brokers. But it really is like an individual preference. We've seen brokers who are once a broker, always broker. They just prefer to stay that role. And others will sort of just take up that mantle for a particular period of time and then transition back to a specialty.
Okay. Another question that came up has to do with whether or not there are any ways of sort of jointly using social network analysis and other kinds of systems approaches. For instance, systems dynamics modeling is an example. So you have these 2 methodologies, and the question has to do with whether they can both be used in combination, how they might interact with each other, and so on.
That's an excellent question. I haven't had a chance to do some trial and error with that yet. I'm open to ideas. I could imagine doing like a cross-check if you were to look at a modular adhocracy over time with your network analysis, and then did a systems flow diagram over that same period of time to see how actual resource flows are changing. That might be able to confirm that. Okay,
let's see. Another question came in, and this has to do with getting data, which is you usually have enough data to actually assess adhocracy at the organizational level. In other words, it's easy to use it as a heuristic, but how often can you actually do real database analysis on it?
Yeah, there are several different ways to gather social network data. One of the least intrusive ways and least time-intensive ways is actually to gather secondary data. So if you were to, for instance, harvest rates of email exchange, that's probably information that your company server is already gathering. So you could set up an algorithm with the help of a computer scientist to generate that social network data automatically real time for you. Otherwise, you could send out a web survey once a month. The most time intensive is sitting down with one-on-one interviews. Hopefully that helps.
Okay. Another question that came in has to do with the characteristics of an adhocracy. How do you know it when you see it?
Yeah, so you're looking in the network data, when you're looking at the screen, you want to see those modules forming and dissolving at different times, just like we saw in the video. In real life, you want to see people moving up and down the scale of collaboration with different partners at different times. So people who didn't used to talk to each other, all of a sudden are forming a work team together and they're working on one particular issue. This is why we call them ad hoc committees, right? And then they disband once that's over, or maybe they form a new standing committee. Or some other form of collaboration.
We have another question. This is sort of moving from the technical, analytic, descriptive issue to the organizational change issue, and that really has to do with what are the best practices for encouraging the development of an adhocracy in an organization?
I don't know if I could speak to best practices. And I haven't done a thorough review of the literature, but being a team builder and running into some of this stuff, right? There's a lot in the organizational change literature that applies here. Things like promoting a culture of trust, giving people permission to talk to others that they don't normally talk to. I've actually run into situations where supervisors don't allow people to seek out non-sanctioned information. Trust is really a big thing that supervisors can do to allow people to do that. So think about places like Google and Facebook and other companies that have known to be really innovative, and look at their kind of best practices and how they promote adhocracy.
Okay. We're coming up at 12:30. That you are at 12:30, but I guess if people want to stay on, we can ask a few more questions. You okay with that?
Yeah, that's fine.
Danielle, can we do that for a couple of minutes?
Yep, no problem.
Okay, so another question really has to do with the environment around these networks. I mean, presumably, you sort of talk as if all of the networks change from within, which could certainly happen. But what about the notion that the nature of the networks changes as its environment changes?
Can you repeat that last question?
Sure. The question is how the environment around the network affects the network.
Yeah,
Presumably
again,
changing and meeting new circumstances.
Yeah. It depends on which stage of the adaptive cycle the system is at. In the front loop, systems tend to be a little bit more, insulated or not as much driven by outside drivers. The back loop is where outside drivers really do perturb the system a little bit more. Again, if we go into the organizational change or organizational management literature, we can look at lots of different scales of how far outside the system do you want to look. Do you want to look at the entire company, or do you want to look at global change and global markets kind of a thing? But I do just want to note that a lot of this modular adhocracy idea overlaps conceptually with Etienne Wenger's communities of practice, in which he also talks about the role of the enabling environment.
Okay. Now, this next question might take longer than we actually have, but a couple of people are asking for an example. We can actually show an example where there were these various sort of brokers and so on and so forth, sort of pin it to some work we've done. But we only have about 2 minutes to do fast. So I don't know if we need to answer that one offline or not.
Yeah, I'll just point people quickly to my website. I do have pictures, sociograms from my thesis. I was not able to do a video like over time for that one, but I do talk through how the modules exist now and how they may have existed in the previous time step. And yeah, we can talk more about that.
Okay, another example and question really has to do with this change process, which is you've got this network in one condition, it moves to another condition. Does it have to dissolve and reform, or do the connections just sort of change? I mean, what happens to the network as it's going through this change process?
Yeah. So this gets to the idea of what are you tracking for the flow in the network? Because often what happens is that maybe the communication flow, the information flow might stop or trail off between two departments, but what has taken place is that connection has transitioned to a different flow, like maybe money or some other form. So if you just picture one form of tie, like we did in the video, you will see ties disappear and then reappear, but they may actually be showing up as something else. This is what we kind of call shadow networks, and that's why terrorists are really hard.
Okay, again, I guess this will be the last question because we are over time, but this has to do with the doing the analysis in terms of how time-consuming it is, how expensive it is, and again, this is going back to the assumption that you're not using it as metaphor, but you're actually doing the technical analysis. What kind of effort or level of effort are we talking about?
Actually, the effort level is pretty low. You do need some basic knowledge of how to, I have, my instructions are for UCINet. And so you just need to know like how to point and click and sort of get data into the software. But it's so easy that it really only takes 15 minutes to analyze modularity, and adhocracy can take a little bit longer depending on if you're looking at qualitative or quantitative data. But I just gave the instructions to my collaborator in Sicily, and he came back to me a week later and was like, I did it. He didn't even ask me for help. So I think it's pretty accessible.
But doesn't that imply that you already have the data if you're looking at a real network?
Yes, yeah. The actual analysis only takes 15 minutes. Collecting the data, of course, will take much longer.
Right. You would want to quantify much longer, would you?
Depends on the method you use to collect your data. Like I said, one-on-one interviews take the longest. A web survey is shorter, but then you have to count time for developing the survey. If you're using secondary data, you could have the data almost immediately.
Right. Okay. Well, we're actually 5 minutes over, and we did promise that we'd end by 12:30. Thank you all for being on this. We do have one more session next month. A couple of people have said that they were interested in what Bethany is doing, and they might contact her offline, so you might get some emails about this. And just to say something about the future, this particular series is going to be over next month with each presentation. But if there's enough interest, we'll kick it off again in the fall. But that implies having people who are willing to do presentations. So I always put that out there. If you're willing to do a presentation, or you know of people who might be willing to do presentations, as I like to say about myself and Danielle, you know where to find us. So send us email, give us a call, and if we can get enough people who are willing to do presentations, we'll do another one in the fall. Let's see, Danielle or Bethany, any final comments?
No, again, if you just didn't have time to have your question answered, please email it to me. I would love to talk about this.
Great. And this whole thing is going to be up as a YouTube video, right, Danielle?
Yeah, if you go to the website where you went to register for the webinar is where we will post Bethany's slides and the link to the webinar.
Fantastic. Well, listen, thank you, everybody. We appreciate this. I can't speak for anybody else, but I have certainly learned an awful lot by doing this. So hopefully everybody else did as well. This is great. Bethany, thanks again, and I can't wait for you to become a Spartan, even though I'm in Ann Arbor.
All right, thanks, everyone.
All right, listen, take care, everybody. This is wonderful. Have a great day, everybody.